So here's my first question. Are we all now convinced that this is the best of all possible worlds?
No.
If there is an all-good God, I think he makes a pretty compelling argument.
Yeah, all these
But
postulates, axioms, definitions later, I don't know that I've come to agree that this is the best or that there was a designed best possible world. That God contemplated all the other worlds and said, nah, this is the best one.
yeah, I mean, I had never thought of it. If God is the creator and if God is all good, then necessarily whatever God creates has to be all good. And so then the problem of evil has always been, well, then how did this evil sneak in here? And Leibniz, it seems like a fairly innovative answer. He's like, well, it had to be there because that's what's required for maximum good. So there can't be any all good, but the best good, the maximum good, inherently necessarily requires evil. I don't know. That seems like a pretty innovative solution.
But did he ever suggest here that like it's the context? This is the best of all possible worlds given the nature of human beings.
No, it's the best of all possible world, period. Like literally, it is the absolute best possible world.
But
And the nature of humanity, our fucked up nature, is a necessary feature of the universe manifesting as the best possible universe.
it just seems like his reasoning comes close to being a tautology.
I want he would go so far as to say that our what you might call human nature is the best of all possible human natures. So it's enveloped in there, right? The best of all possible worlds, and you can't hold human nature as a qualifying the check, best of all possible worlds, except for that we put humans in it because the humans are a piece of the best of all possible world. So it's the best of all possible human natures that is the component of the best of all possible worlds.
Yeah, and I thought another innovative move. I mean, when I say innovative, I don't know because I don't know scholastic philosophy well and all that. But at least in terms of the things I've learned or heard of, um, that it seems like a lot of Christian philosophers have said, well, the ultimate purpose of God was to maximize human happiness. And, Leibniz explicitly says, no, that's not what it was. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to maximize perfection and harmony of the whole system. And that allows for a certain amount of human happiness. But maximizing human happiness is not the ultimate overall main purpose of the creation. I thought that was pretty radical too.
I thought it was okay. So one of the things that Leibniz says is that for God's glory, that there needs to be humans, or not necessarily humans, but uh, rational or reasonable minds, which humans fulfill the sufficient condition of that. But also, so I believe angels also would, and genies, which Leibniz talks about, by the way. But uh, so for God's glory, it needs to be recognized by rational, reasonable minds. And that seemed to be something that was kind of, you're folding humans and human reason into kind of like this divine structure where it seems, I don't know, maybe it's kind of like my selection of sources from, but I was thinking there's at least one version of kind of like maybe like this is like a negative theology tradition that'd be like, no, God doesn't have anything to do with humans. He's independent of humans. And then his glory is kind of sufficient to itself. Doesn't require humans. And I thought that would be more of the traditional Christian perspective. But Nevin, what you just said, that would be different. Although, but yeah, I'm just not aware of any Christian philosophers that would argue for or that have argued that God is there to kind of increase human happiness or maximize that.
Oh,
I don't
good
know.
point.
Is
Maybe
like
I'm
Aquinas or somebody say that?
no, maybe I'm just wrong.
Yeah, I mean, like you, I don't know the scholastics super well. It's about that. So
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's that the greatest. I'm remembering, like Augustine says, the greatest good is happiness. But but I mean, he explicitly says that, and and then he says, but the only way, but he's talking about human happiness. So the greatest human good is happiness, but you can only achieve that in union with God, and then so on. But um, but that's not the same thing as saying that God's fundamental purpose is to make humans happy. So I may have misstated that. I may be wrong about that. But I'm think the reason I said it that way is because there's some places I think in the Theodicy in this book where Leibniz says something like that, something about, people say that God's ultimate purpose was to maximize happiness, but that's not the case. But maybe he was saying that the God's purpose for humanity was to maximize their happiness. Maybe that's maybe that's what he said. And then maybe he's disputing that, that God's greatest goal for humanity was to maximize their happiness, contrary to what Augustine and others have said. But that can't be it, because maximizing human happiness would not provide for the maximum goodness in the whole system. So maybe I misspoke. Maybe it was more something like that.
My memory of Augustine would be I would be very surprised if he thought the greatest good would be human happiness, because the some of the writings, the more political writings, so to speak, was him kind of chastising people who were complaining. See what happened when the Roman Empire became Christian? We've had these invasions, if we had just stayed with the pagan faith. And he's like, wait a second, this is not transactional. This isn't, we're Christians, therefore good things will always come to us. And but it is in the context of the complaints about what has happened politically, lack of a term, internationally to Rome since the dominance of Christianity. But it's a kind of just a different orientation.
yeah, I think you'd say that at least for Leibniz, um, so the happiness of humans is something that is at least a criterion that matters for the selection of the best world, but it's not the sole one. Instead, it's a more almost like a effect of the best is also kind of as a consequence, you would have something that tries to maximize happiness. Although I can't remember him at least using the term happiness that I can remember. I think he says something maybe like that, but
Yeah,
either way, I think he definitely believes that the God wants to make things it's kind of like the best as a overall convergent world, there's a trickle down theory almost to it, where the best is the overall world will trickle down to humans in general, but also to individual monads. And one of the most interesting things I think that he talks about in these last sections is that it isn't necessarily that, oh, well, some things you ought to sacrifice individual monads or this thing in order to have the best thing overall. So he resists that, which I thought that would be the kind of like the standard idea of, a sort of moral harmony of things is okay, a bad thing happens to this thing individually, but that's for the overall good. Instead, he's saying that really it's the overall good sort of trickles down to also the overall individual good. So that the best of all possible worlds is also the best possible world for each individual thing, each substance, which sounds pretty extreme, but that's how Leibniz does things. Like take things to the extreme of individuality. So I found that quite interesting.
Consistent. It's extreme but consistent, right?
Yep.
There's also those different types of will, which really confuses things. So, there's the kind of will like God wills that I don't know that I think you're right. He does. I searched for happiness. I only found one instance, but he definitely, God wills for all humans to be good, but I forgot what kind of will. That's one kind of will, but then humans' free will fucks that up, and and then there's another kind of divine will associated with that, and so it all gets very messy and complicated. There's so many factors involved, but I think in general I've overstated the case that I said at the beginning, so not correct, I think.
I want to say something like, when Ed brought up on Wednesday, Goethe's various attitude towards the cosmos, depending on what mode he's operating in, whether he's a poet or a philosopher or a statesman. And I want to say, for me, the thesis that this is the best of all possible worlds, to me, seems plausible for somebody who's undergoing trauma or experiencing a personal trauma, and to help pull them through. This is where I could countenance this as a decent, cohesive way to view the world, right? But this is just I'm not just being charitable. I think it makes sense, but more I want to draw the line because it becomes obscene when it becomes a part of public reason. I want to say it's perfectly valid if you want to think this to yourself privately, especially if you're going through a hard time in life. You know what I mean? To console yourself. For example, just the last one, right? Finally, under this perfect government, there will be no good action without reward, no bad action without punishment. It's very Kantian for me to come out and say it's perfectly fine for you to think or to tell yourself that, everything good is eventually rewarded and everything bad is eventually punished, to motivate yourself. But you know what I mean? That's you privately. In terms of a public use of reason, we can't be appealing to heaven or hell, and we can't be pretending that in the here and now, good deeds don't go unpunished, and villainy isn't rewarded, right? We all know what kind of world we live in. We can't be appealing to a beyond unless you're just trying to do, you're doing this for your personal journey. But in terms of a public use of reason, we can't be appealing to heaven and hell to correct the ledger of here and now, especially after Auschwitz, especially after Hiroshima, and I could continue.
But Leibniz is not appealing to heaven and hell, at least not entirely, because his motivation, it seems to me theoretical. It's philosophical and theoretical. If there is a good God who's the creator, then the universe necessarily has to be good. How do you make sense of that? But because then the stuff we looked at today, he's saying, well, you don't know. He's like, there's other intelligent beings in the universe that may be a whole lot happier than you are on your little planet. There may be other types of rational entities. There may be this, there. And then he has that move, where he says, well, if you can't prove that it's not true, then you're permitted to believe that it might be true. And so, that at least he's not appealing to heaven and hell. He's just saying the universe is really big. And so he takes it. I mean, it seems like to me, he just takes it. that makes him invulnerable to empirical evidence, because I kept putting these little notes, the kind of thing that you said, like, well, everybody gets what they deserve. So I'm like, this is clearly empirically false. I mean, Kant knows that, right? I mean, that's the psalmist in the Bible knows that. He's bitching about, why do good people suffer and bad people do well. And so, but the thing is, Leibniz's argument is invulnerable to evidence, because he's appealing to possible evidence to which we can never have any access. The totality of the universe and the possibility of intelligent beings elsewhere and so on, which is, I don't know,
I mean,
it's sort of an unsatisfying move.
I agree with you, Nevin. I know I didn't say Leibniz was bringing in heaven and hell. I was just kind of like rehashing the Kantian territory, that we
Ah,
look at this and see kind of what's going on, right? I agree. I don't think Leibniz is evoking heaven and hell, but I also agree with you that because the way he makes his claims, it ends up becoming non-falsifiable, becomes really difficult to use in a public use of reason. Well, ultimately you don't know. Well, now what have you just done here? You've just appealed to this big mystical space, and that's,
or
at
even,
one,
I mean, I don't think he would say it's mystical, because he's appealing to, like, literally other intelligent beings in the physical universe, at least in part. But I think, if I was if I mean, people do this, right? They do this kind of thing. So if I was a priest and I went to someone who was undergoing extreme suffering, and I said, well, in the grand scheme of things, your suffering right now is not that significant, because there's a whole lot of other beings in the universe possibly that are a whole lot happier than you are. I mean, it's worse than worthless. It's cruel.
I was just gonna say, I think I agree with Eric that at the individual level, I see it as almost being sort of humanist and sort of like we're participating in a spirit where things balance out and everything will be all right. Even I don't know why the example of a mother experiencing something tragic, right, with her child. It's like something that's so uh outside of being rational, but paradoxically amplifying it to like a more social, political level, very much reactionary to change, to trying to reason out things that are perhaps causing a lot of the suffering that's going on. So,
Well, that's the thing. I mean, okay, we can't prove he's wrong, but he can't prove that our criticism of his being wrong is wrong. I mean, if there's no appeal to any, if there's no appeal, then right? What?
Yeah,
I
it
think
seems
that you can't tell me I'm wrong, so therefore, haha, just like I don't know. There's almost a I don't know, a willfulness of saying, yeah, I've just created this neat little logical argument that you can't pry open, but that doesn't make it compelling for me.
oh, it kind of makes me a little angry.
Yeah, so I think he wants to, so he's presenting this a priori argument that, if you follow reason, then it entails that this is the best of all possible worlds, blah blah blah. And I think the reason why there's no posteriori aspect to it is that we would have to have the wisdom of
Mm.
God in order to be able to see that. In which case, or you'd have to almost include every empirical case, instance, phenomena overall altogether uh, simultaneously in order for it to work, which
that's why
obviously we can't do.
I maybe
That's right.
misspoke earlier, but when I said appeal to mysticism, it was an appeal to what we don't know, the unknowable, right? If you don't see this as the best of all possible worlds, that's because you don't know everything like God knows everything. And maybe mysticism was the wrong word, right? But you know,
Yeah.
and to me that's dangerous. And couldn't you just easily say, couldn't you flip it? You know, if you don't believe that this is the worst of all possible worlds, that's because you don't yet have knowledge of all of the empirical facts and don't see the world as God sees the totality. Because if you did, then you would know that it's the worst of all possible worlds, because God's really like secretly, you know, a sadist. Not secretly, explicitly. Look around you. He's a sadist, you know. Most of the evidence will confirm that. But if ever you have a moment of pleasure or joy and you think not, well, that's because you don't know everything. If you knew everything like God, then you would see how sadistic it really is.
So what you're saying is, if I don't want to put words in your mouth, Eric, but if someone has this kind of argument, the starting point is extraordinarily important, because you can say, well, the world is total crap, and right, you know, and then, but, you know, because we don't know these other things, right? Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to come off like curmudgeonly. I think there's a lot to admire here in what Leibniz is doing. I just feel like this is a big chink in the armor right here, right? He ultimately at some point appeals to what we don't know, what he doesn't know and I don't know and you don't know and we can't know. But that would fill in the gap. You know what I mean? That's, you know, and to me, that's not a move you're allowed to make it. Is it? Right?
Well, it seems
It's a-
I defer to you and Nevitt and Chase, but wouldn't it be kind of like an unphilosophical dick move?
So the way I see it is that he's making a rational appeal to that we can know that there's these aspects that are unknown empirically, but it's definitely something that can be known rationally. So that's why I would say it's not a mysticism. Is like Nevitt's saying, mysticism, yeah, usually an appeal to the direct experience of the divine. I think that's right. So Leibniz, you know, I mean, there seems to be this kind of confrontation with a negative theology kind of in the background here, where because you know Leibniz, he's definitely very much a rationalist, and there's things that he's saying that we could rationally understand about the divine that is kind of unusual from at least it seems like to me unusual from a perspective of just like a pure Christianity or whatnot. And then even then, you know, there's kind of mysticism also that would say, well, you can have a direct experience of, say, something like the infinite, but then you, in that sense, have similar knowledge in that it's a kind of known unknown. So, oh, I had an experience of the infinite. I know it can't be completely grasped, especially by our puny human models and whatnot. So instead, I have to use metaphors and analogies and whatnot.
Yeah.
You know, there's something similar, but he very much believes that the route to go is through reason, and
You know,
that's yeah.
I think if you accept that if you accept a particular conception of God, like God is all good, omnipotent, omniscient, so on, the omni-God, and that God is creator, then I think a lot follows from that. And I think, Chase is right. If you start off with that, and if you accept that as a fundamental axiom, which I'm not sure. I mean, if you denied that, I'm not sure what he would say. He probably would just say, well, you're stupid. But if you accept that as a fundamental axiom, well, then I think you're right. There's a lot you can do to prove, sort of deductively based on that fundamental axiom. Like the universe has to be all good. It must be. But then, something that the comment that Joey made makes me think, or makes me wonder. I know we tossed this around a few times before, but is the aesthetic element here in the best? And so one of the things I've been wondering is whether because some of his criteria seem to be not things you could literally deduce from the meaning of good, but they seem to have this aesthetic quality, harmony, like the whole harmony thing and those sorts of things. And I'm wondering if he might argue that those what I think of as aesthetic criteria are actually sort of wrapped up within reason, maybe. I don't know. And like I don't know Kant well, no, I don't know the critique of judgment at all, but I'm wondering if maybe if he would ultimately reduce everything to reason rather than, it seems to me, you've got these rational criteria, but then you also have these aesthetic judgments about perfection and harmony and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I think that aspect is really interesting. I think what he wants to do is sort of have reason and aesthetics sort of have a basis in a kind of ultimate ontology. And you can have like specific uh fields then of especially aesthetics and whatnot, but it's really, we have aesthetic beauty, harmony, musical harmony, whatnot, but that's just kind of a species of a larger phenomena, which is the world, which is the harmony of the world. And that's ultimately what musical harmony comes from. So it's kind of, yeah, aesthetics is a kind of ontological thing. And at
In
least
Leibniz.
that's the way it makes sense to me.
Just to be clear, Chase, that you were speaking back about Leibniz, right? Aesthetics is ultimately has an ontological grounding.
Yeah, that's what it seems like.
Yeah,
That's
no,
me trying to make sense of Leibniz. Yeah.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I'm only clarifying it because you followed after Nevitt talking about the critique of the power of judgment, and you didn't quite put Leibniz's name in there, so it could have been understood that you were talking about Kant there. In which case, I would have said, absolutely not. Are we going to talk about aesthetics as having an ontological grounding?
Yeah, I don't know if enough. I started reading some of Critique of Judgment, but I do not know enough about Kant to be able to say one way or another. So I will definitely defer to you on that.
But wouldn't the ontological grounding be ultimately? I don't know why I say this. I keep wanting to think that Leibniz would want to trace everything back to reason ultimately. That would say, if there's an ontological manifestation of something, it's because this all good rational God put it there. Like the cosmos is a kind of a manifestation of God. So whatever the ontological grounding is, it's got to be a reflection of this, the character of the deity.
Right. Yeah, that's what he says is the what is distinct about rational minds is that they're, I can't remember the exact phrasing of it, but so the monads are expressions of the same world, but rational minds are also uh, imitations, reflections that imitate the divine mind, or I guess he's a mind. Yeah.
It's definitely a
So,
moment.
yeah, and that's what separates uh, rational minds from what all the other monads. It makes
Would
them kind of higher in the hierarchy, but that also would entail that, yeah, definitely reason is very much a divine thing. It comes from the imitation of humans kind of understanding to God's understanding.
would
So, yeah.
Leibniz have known about Occam's razor?
Yeah.
Because I was thinking when you all were talking about here's aesthetics, an appearance of an aesthetic sense, but yet his emphasis on reason. I'm thinking, the hard sciences have had a aesthetic sense for quite some time that the simpler answer is the best answer, right? If you have two explanations, one's more complicated than the other, take the simpler one. And that seems to go back to really very early science. And so I was just trying to build on what you all were saying to say, well, maybe the bridge here where aesthetics and reason seem to be two different realms. Well, think of how that aesthetic sense of simplicity of the explanation was embedded in science and still exists today. Because when Crick and Watson proposed the model for the DNA molecule in the 50s, they had a couple different models to work from, and the one they picked was the one that was, for lack of a term, cleaner, more elegant in its simplicity.
Yeah, and then I know string theory has been famous for saying that, oh well, there's no verifying empirical evidence, but kind of their argument is based off the sheer, I can't remember the actual terms they use for it, but it's just really nice how the harmonics come together with these equations.
Yeah.
And well, that's kind of evidence, right?
Yeah, I mean, I am so tempted to say, well, obviously Occam's razor is a rational criteria. Obviously, principles of efficiency and all this stuff. But the more I think about it, it's like, well, I really, I mean, I don't. So, I kind of with Ed, it seems like there's these criteria that are implicitly aesthetic and probably always have been.
Yeah, it points back to the good, the true, and the beautiful, and an integral kind of unity or identity or relationship between them, right? But yeah, absolutely, the scientific method is shot through with normativity.
Maybe
I agree
this
with that. Yeah.
this is a bit of a digression. I don't mean to push it too far, but I asked this question up there: is the because Plato's all about reason. Are the good, the true, and the beautiful? Are they what is the word I used? Features or aspects? Or are these implicit in reason? Because I find it interesting that reason is not in that list. It's not the rational, it's the good, the true, and the beautiful are like the big ones.
I think that was what made me reference that comment when you were saying reason. I'm kind of just like, where do those three things fit in? Which I feel like Leibniz is trying to create space for in those like three aspects of God that he talks about.
Now you're on the microphone, Joey. You have to do it. You have to read it to the rhythm of the Law and Order SVU intro, because honestly, I don't know if I can recall that to my mind. I don't watch. Original Law and Order, dun 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 dun, and that's all I know. So SVU, fill me in, sing it.
The SVU thing that I was referencing was just like in the beginning, before the dun dun, that thing which is associated with SVU, right? Where they have the little like vignette where they explain or they show the guy committing the crime, the heinous crime, right? Because I can't remember the monologue in its entirety, but it's something like in the Department of what is it? Sexually violent something, I don't know. There are especially heinous crimes committed or something like that, right? And they're saying it like that. These are their stories. So that's why when I saw Nevitt say that, I thought the good, the true, and the beautiful. Are these all implicit in reason? And then the dun dun happens, and then you cut to the lawyers sort of like, what's going on? What's the case?
I can do it now, Jason. That fills it in. Thank you. Perfect. It wasn't, I was thinking it was musical or lyrical, but no, it's that prologue, that little, prologue piece that happens at the beginning of every episode. So thank you. Thanks for the performance.
Well, it makes me also wonder what would be the rhythm to read Leibniz in, and somewhat as a reference to Deleuze's last chapter in his Leibniz book is all about music and like music theory and like reading as like philosophy as music. And this is totally independent, but I'm recalling too of like I've been listening to various just little
It's got to be Bach or some Baroque, but Bach's the most Baroque, right?
I wouldn't know. But I'm recalling someone's like referencing that like in a podcast I was listening to, some philosopher people, they had said something like Nietzsche wished that he wrote in Italian because it has a pacing that would have been like nicer for his writing. I just remember thinking like, wow, that's interesting.
I mean, in all seriousness, I know you maybe were partially joking, Eric, but from in the whole way, all of you have been discussing Leibniz for this whole time we've been reading him. Bach seems to be spot on, and someone who I think would be a terrible match would be somebody like Beethoven. I just think it would be a train wreck, to try to reconcile. But Bach and Leibniz here seem to just be simpatico. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought of Beethoven too and rejected that pretty quickly. And then I just put in the chat Schoenberg is the opposite. I want to say Schoenberg is like at the opposite pole. It doesn't come back to the middle or to the, like it doesn't fit back together. It doesn't form a cohesive rational whole that you get resolutions.
Since we're speaking about music, Nevet, have you heard Nietzsche's piano pieces? I encountered them on YouTube actually a while
I
ago.
have not.
Yeah, I'll send a link here.
Oh, thank you. I actually didn't know he did that. I mean, some of his books have bits of poetry in them, but
Yeah, he composed things. I've heard
I feel stupid
part
now.
of one. Yeah.
Yeah, they're
Uh,
not I mean, I could never do that, right? But compared to the contemporary music that was going on, they're not like, I mean, obviously he wasn't a famous musician, but they're interesting.
That seems to be a polite way of describing them. Oh, she's nice.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're doing anything particularly crazy, but he's obviously very apt at coming up with things. It just he was better at philosophy.
He loved
uh,
aesthetics, though. He was big into music and poetry and such.
What form did his music take? I mean, could you apply it to any existing musical forms that existed in the Western musical canon?
I wouldn't be able to expand on that very, very eloquently, honestly. I've been detached from explaining music. I took a music literature class a long time ago.
Without having heard it, so I may be off base, but without having heard it, I would feel that chromaticism would apply.
What does that mean?
Uh,
that's
yeah. It's
uh
Go ahead.
I was thinking I'm not exactly sure how to explain that. So chromaticism is if you have notes. I'm imagining it like a fretboard of a guitar. You have notes that are adjacent or contiguous with each other, and it would be like going like do 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 like that. Um, the Batman theme has some chromatic stuff in it.
A
Yeah.
lot of half steps. A lot of half steps,
Mhm.
But yeah, Wagner deployed that. So that's the main reason why. Um, that's one of like Wagner's innovations.
Yeah, I think the fact that Nietzsche was friends with Wagner for a little bit at least, probably I'm guessing that was probably somewhat discouraging for his own musical as musical ambitions. In the same way, I don't know if you're friends with, you know, Beethoven or whatnot, it would also probably be yeah. So
Right.
like, I'll be the person who gives the theory behind the music instead. I think that's what he realized that's what he was going to do, that there was no competing with Wagner.
It's a good time for me to plug Adorno as a composer. He was also a composer as well. I think it's better, it's more, probably better known than Nietzsche's as a composer. Adorno, aspired to, he actually, before studying philosophy, went to study under Alan Berg, who was a student of Schoenberg in the atonal system. So I mean, honestly, I've never really been able to sink my teeth into that movement. I appreciate it from a distance, and maybe with some more time, I can appreciate it from close up. But yeah, not exactly my cup of tea. And he famously said some things about jazz that I think are actually kind of accurate for the jazz he was looking at, but not accurate for jazz writ large.
I believe Deleuze and Guattari cite him as well as they have a bunch of stuff about the experimental music people and what's the I think it's some 20th century innovation in music was serial music. And there's something about that is important. But I tried to listen to it as well, and I was like, what the hell is this? Like, I don't know. I'm just gonna listen to Radiohead or something. Um, but yeah, okay. So for Leibniz, okay, yeah. So I read that last chapter of The Fold where it makes all the connections with Baroque music, but I don't remember any actual musician being named. So I know he talks about this kind of uncanny uh harmony between Leibniz's philosophy of harmony and the innovations of Baroque music. And he mentioned some names that I do not recall, I believe, but no famous musicians that at least that I know of. Not that I know a great deal about Baroque music necessarily. Um, but yeah, okay, so to kind of go back to some of the things talking about earlier, so I think what Leibniz wants to do is actually have kind of a harmony between those the ontological and the moral and the aesthetic. And the aesthetic is almost kind of the in-between kind of that brings it together. But that's the whole, the principles of nature and grace, or the parallelisms between body and mind and or souls and bodies, whatnot. Yeah, then he also shows that it's the same thing with also with morality and nature. So that they're kind of two different compartments, but in harmony with each other for the same reason that also kind of the spontaneity of freedom and final causes is in this kind of pre-established harmony also with efficient causes and nature and bodies and all that.
Let me ask a question about that, because when reading that stuff, like you said, it's what I thought he was saying is that moral consequences are kind of built into like physical causation, so that whatever would be morally correct is sort of played. It doesn't require. I mean, he seems to. I get the impression that maybe he allows place for divine miracles, but he's like he does not. He thinks the occasionalists like make everything into a miracle. So I'm not sure about what he thinks about miracles, but that primarily what is morally correct is going to be God has set it up such that that's going to be taken care of by natural conditions. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. So the commentary is talked quite a bit about that aspect, and he So he is going to constantly try to not have miracles go on. It's similar to how he talks about, okay, yeah, God can create and annihilate monads, and that's kind of the one supernatural thing that goes on, but God wouldn't actually annihilate anything because he's a good dude. Wouldn't do that. Um, but in the way that he's resistant to supernatural influences, and also this is his critique of occasionalism, is that it turns everything into a miracle. So he'll say that also with moral things too. And, especially in the terms of punishments and rewards to get dealt out, he'll say that, okay, yeah, things like natural occurrences then just happen to have a harmony then with the uh, bad or good things you do and the corresponding punishments or rewards that correspond with them. So for example, he talks about, I'm trying to remember what is actually in the Monadology and what is the commentator gives a lot of excerpts from other things, but he talks about so he did a lot of stuff with geology and was pretty innovative in that as well. And so one thing he talked about was stuff like earthquakes and floods and whatnot. And he believed that even something like the biblical flood was a natural occurrence. And it just happened to go along with the moral aspect that what the world was corrupt, so God sent a flood to kind of start over. That's the moral aspect of it, but that has a harmony with just the natural aspect that, oh shit, there's a flood. Bang. Efficient causes. Uh so yeah, one of those things, I don't know. Like the whole thing with pre-established harmony is like, okay, see what you're going with that, but it always sits in a way where you're like, I don't, yeah, okay. I think especially this is especially true when there's morality involved with it, and is I think also the conclusion that like bad things happen to bad people. I don't know. Doesn't seem the case to me.
I'm really uncomfortable saying this because I've been really, being rather disparaging tonight towards old Schopenhauer. But when you talked about how in your reading, Chase, that Schopenhauer would say, well, of course, there's natural phenomena, right?
Or Leibniz.
Oh, begging your pardon, Leibniz, begging your pardon, Leibniz, natural phenomenon. And of course, we can scientifically explain those phenomena. But when nature, a natural event, impinges on human beings, then we can see a moral consequence of actions. But in a sense, the people are being punished, or the community is being punished through nature or by nature, right? Through the mechanism of nature. The reason why I'm saying I'm uncomfortable about that, there have been a lot of archaeologists and historians of the ancient world who have now tied together the massive explosion, volcanic explosion on the island of, I don't remember its old name, but it broke the island it was on into like 3 islands. And I think the largest one today is, I don't know if it's pronounced Thera, but it's spelled Thera. And that explosion was seen to have destroyed the Minoan civilization. But by that time, it had sunk roots on the Greek mainland. Well, what they did was they were looking at estimating the year when that was happening, and basically said a volcanic explosion, eruption of that magnitude would have created a tsunami. And And that was their interpretation of the Nile River changing color, one of the first, right, one of the first plagues by Moses in Pharaonic Egypt. And so, I mean, that just jumped out at me when you talked about, sure, there's natural phenomenon and we can explain it all, but then how, okay, when it impinges on human beings, well, now there's this moral admonishment, but it does seem that that different, you know, there would be consequences to a tsunami hitting the Nile River Valley. That at least in part are, you can see in the narrative with Moses and the Pharaoh.
Oh, yeah, even further, I want to say, like, you know, you could generalize the thesis that nature is an instrument of divine justice. You know, if a group of people decide to choose unclean practices and they start dying of disease, well, shit, you know, maybe you should have brushed your teeth before you gone to bed. You know what I mean? Like, and just even in the ancient world, right? Customs, you know, we have our customs, they have their customs. Which tribe will be stronger, will survive, will win out in the struggle, you know, and it's, you know, it's a function of our customs, but it's also a function of nature.
There seems to be a tension here, and maybe Leibniz could resolve it, but you know, when, like I was saying earlier, you know, when people would complain about, well, look, there's all this bad stuff happening in the human world, and Leibniz says, yeah, but you don't know what's going on elsewhere in the universe, and you know, the totality of it's going to be okay. But then that seems to be in tension with saying that the course of nature takes care of moral justice and so on this, you know, among us. That seems to be in tension, because if the second one was really true, then you would think that the books would be balanced here on this planet. And I mean, it's just so obviously false. That claim, you know, I mean, like I said, the psalmist in the Bible is that long ago is bitching about, you know, why do all these assholes have great lives and all us good Jews are suffering all the time? I mean, and I mean, it's a whole Jewish, it's a whole Jewish meme, right? That's been going on for hundreds of years, is are we so fucked up when God loves us? So I don't know.
Right?
It's almost, I mean, it's sort of tragically laughable.
I start every semester in the ethics and society class kind of pointing to Socrates, you know, who was, again, Plato was pissed off, right? But you know, from Plato's perspective and a lot of others, you know, Socrates was punished because he tried to bring truth into the world. And then early Christians who were folding Greek philosophy into their theology thought Plato had some awesome ideas about these forms and everything. And Socrates is a bit of a prologue for the life of Christ. I mean, he was trying to bring truth. He got killed. Well, our Savior was trying to bring love and truth into the world. He got killed. And then I put it to my students, and that's not just in the ancient world. Can you name a figure, an American political figure from the 1960s who was assassinated? You know, I mean, we can list a few of them, right? And why? Why was MLK assassinated? You know, again, no good deed goes unpunished here in America, right? Try to make the world a better place and see how much resistance immediately lines up at your door.
Gandhi.
I took a religion class that covered Socrates, Jesus, Gandhi, and MLK. And yeah, so especially that connection with Socrates and Jesus has been noted.
Oh yeah.
In antiquity, I mean, yeah, early Christians were hitting on that a lot. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can see, you know, Kierkegaard also finds some significance in that because he liked Socrates a lot.
And of course, I name drop Oscar Romero as well. Yeah, it's throwing a bone to, you know, I keep saying it. I'm not a Catholic. There's no danger I'll ever join the Catholic Church. But from the outside, I got a lot of respect for strains. And so I'm going to drop Oscar Romero's name for those students who are of that persuasion. You know, if this is the kind of thing you're into.
Yeah.
Yeah, so did Romero say something along those lines about the Socrates Jesus connection, or do you know what that would be?
Oh, I thought Eric was bringing him up as an example of a martyr, you know, someone who was speaking truth
Oh,
to
okay, okay.
power, you know, and then he was assassinated when he was performing mass in 1980, 81, very early in you know, the El Salvadorian Civil
Yeah.
War.
Sorry, I was not thinking of the biographical,
Oh, okay.
but that makes more sense.
And the thing is, I mean, to get real quickly, Romero was not a liberation theologian. I mean, he was picked to be the top dude for the Catholic Church in El Salvador because he was considered a moderate, right? And he's looking at just the agony of the El Salvadorian people and just the death squads, which I don't like to use that term because we're basically talking about soldiers in uniform driving army vehicles many times in broad daylight, and people are seeing whose house they're going to. You know, so when we say death squads, it could create another group separate from the military. These are just military who decided that they were judge, jury, and executioner, and they could literally kill people because they thought they were fill in the blank.
Um, so one thing that I've was wondering because I didn't have time to read the Theodicy excerpts again, and I was kind of wondering about so you know in doing a Theodicy where Leibniz he's the district attorney the defense for God. So it's pretty easy to kind of put human events, say that, oh yeah, human free will, you know, they do it themselves, morality, blah, blah, blah. But then for natural events, especially the things, you know, they're talking about like earthquakes and floods and all these things. That's always been harder to explain and give this kind of theodicy defense for. And see, I think it's evident what his general argument will be is, you know, the same thing, this pre-established harmony between them, but and that still these things are natural events, but they have these the harmonies between, you know, punishment, reward, and the moral actions of people. I'm kind of wondering, like, how does he do that exactly? And then, so one thing though that I was kind of thinking of, so he has one thing he does allow that I think kind of gets him off the hook a little bit is that there's a delay in these things, and even a delay in that something could be punishment or reward even in your next life because of this strange idea of life and pseudo death that he has, where, you know, we have one soul that keeps the same body that kind of either has parts and comes together as like a living organic being, and then it dies, it goes to this, you know, the pre-formation seed. So it's this kind of, we have, you know, multiple lives. Yes, yeah, very karmic. There's, yeah, definitely. So your karmic traces can go from one life to the next, so that, oh crap, I'm got hit with a tornado, and you know, the house fell on me, and I'm gonna die in horrible agony slowly, because the tornado house fell on me.
You're a wicked
Great.
witch.
Why is this happening? Well, it could be this is a few lives ago I did something. But I don't know. I think this is so my personal take, I'll say I like Buddhism a lot in general, but I think karma is one of the worst concepts ever. It's just terrible, especially if you okay, so I took a class on Buddhism and looked at a lot of different so there it's very, very versatile, but you could kind of see how not just Buddhism but Hinduism, anything, because that's where it comes from. But how karma actually operates in these societies is very much social control, in that, well, each everybody gets their own, and maybe next life things will be better for you. Uh, and I think you can see also how Leibniz has not just with the kind of like karma similarities, but kind of the larger picture also that he's getting at, where God is a giant king and is the best king there, but the same way, it has this kind of a the influences where, yeah, don't change the status quo because it's divinely set up. So government, and even have this kind of imitation. As humans, we're just imitations of the divine, and it happens to follow this same structure of a monarchy too. So I think that has the same inevitable influence as you get with also with something like a karma of, yeah, the people in charge, they ultimately deserve to be there. People that have good things happen to them deserve that. People that have bad things happen to them deserve that. And that's just the way it is.
Yeah, the way I thought about that in Leibniz is if it's like, so God is the grand artist and God is creating this work with maximum perfection, the best, like it's as perfect as can possibly be. And that perfect system requires that, like, I mean, I tend to think of like there's gears or something. It's just this giant system that all is working to maximize perfection. But that maximizing perfection requires that certain individuals within that suffer a great deal. It's just part of the system. It's gotta, be that way. And then so then if someone says, God, my life, I was born, I lived, for 50 years in extreme suffering, and then I died, that, Leibniz could say something like, well, man, it sucks for you, but that's kind of the role you play in this great system of perfection. And I, you're just part of the system, and I'm sorry, but that's the part of the system that you ended up with. I don't know. That's the sort of sense that I get, which is similar, to what you're saying. I mean, I don't see that in Leibniz there's any rebuttal to that. You're just you're the part of the system that you need to be to make the whole thing. It's kind of like some justifications for, like with Judas, that some Christian theologians said, well, Judas had to perform that job. Somebody had to do that. And God, ordained that Judas would do that. And yeah, granted, Judas went to hell. Sorry. But he had a role to play. Somebody had to do it, and he was the guy. And I find that very frustrating, very, I don't know. Yeah, that makes me angry too.
Yeah, I was just putting it in the chat, but I wasn't getting the sense that, and this is also a question, but like that all events are reward and punishment. Like can certain events also just kind of like happen? We're just caught up in it. My happiness isn't top priority, but it's not necessarily a punishment. Um, and it's just kind of, like the way that Nevitt was phrasing it, I feel like was making sense with that line of thought of just like, sorry, you just happen to be caught in a bad harmony. Um, and it's like, that's for the best in some other conditions. But it's not necessarily like a punishment to me for my actions, but maybe still like all my actions may have their own natural rewards and punishments built in, but certain disasters may be happening that we look at and we're just like, what could, a village or a person have done to deserve something like that? And it's not that they necessarily did, but then that's from this perspective, like setting up something that needed to happen.
Yeah, I think so when I previously read sort of a chunk of the Theodicy of was that maybe a few years ago, and that was definitely one of the lasting impressions I got was that sense of, well, the totality kind of subsumes the small infinitesimals of bad things. But then in the Monadology, he talks about, well, it's also not just the whole that's the best thing, but it's also the individuals themselves. So I was like, wow, that's quite the criterion to establish there. Um, which I think that also necessarily requires then, well, you need multiple lives at that point because even aside from the punishment or you know moral badness, punishment, goodness, reward aspect, just the fact of, well, how can this be the best possible life for each individual? I think that itself requires succession and variety through time, events to happen through time. And it's the same thing of, well, but that's, of course, has to harmonize with the whole then. And indeed, that is kind of it, is that succession through time of all these individuals that eventually adds up to the best thing for those individuals, then is ultimately harmonized with the best thing overall for the totality of, yeah, it's hard to keep all the harmonies together, but yeah, there's definitely going to be some dissonance. But then, good music has variety in it, and that necessarily requires some kind of dissonance, even if it's just to have some resolution of it. Same way, what a narrative, the common thing, you need a conflict. Story without a conflict is just boring. So I can see where it's coming from that, and that kind of goes into really, it feels like the strongest part of his argument is this kind of like appeal to a sort of aesthetic totality where you can get an intuitive sense, at least, of what he's kind of getting at. Yeah.
So are you saying, based on what you had read, that that the indestructibility of soul monads does suggest that over repeated lifetimes that the individual would somehow acquire maximum felicity or something like that over the course of many lifetimes?
Yeah, that they would have the best possible life. I'm not sure exactly how to phrase it, but it wouldn't be necessarily evident from just looking at their one single life. It would require multiple ones. And I think that gets them out of having, so it could then be a question of empirical verification or the opposite of that or lack thereof if it was came down to just simply one life. So we could look at, somebody's biography, especially if say, I don't know, like infants or whatever that have very short lives, like, oh, an infant lives for a few days, suffers, dies, hard to explain. But if you have multiple lives connected to that, even, hypothetically future lives where that soul monad will go on to be embodied in other ways in the future, that gets them out of being able to, yeah, have that single life thing but what's so unusual about that is that seems very different from Christianity, which for Christianity is, all about the single life thing. But who knows? I don't know.
There was a engineering professor at Colorado State University years ago when I lived in Fort Collins that claimed, and he would give this lecture every year, that claimed that very early Christianity actually believed in reincarnation, and he had a whole set of texts and stuff to support that. But
Yeah,
interesting.
I think so. I think there's something to that. I mean, I'm no expert in that or anything like that, but from what I've seen about very early Christianity, there's the connection with the mystery religions and Gnosticism and whatnot. And then, of course, the fact that it's not a fact, but let's say that it seems to be a strong influence of the doctrine of the immortal soul, that it's really a kind of Platonic idea. It doesn't have much of a biblical basis in it, where the Bible talks about, the reincarnation of the body. That's a big thing. And I know Leibniz, he talks about that and mentions that a bunch, that this is a requirement, but the kind of the standard picture of, you have one life, and then when you die, you then are judged and you go to heaven or hell. That doesn't seem to jive well with Leibniz or also with early Christianity or lots of things really. But yeah.
Sorry, I didn't want to. I apologize for interrupting.
But yeah, I think that's definitely true that early Christianity has this connection with reincarnation, and so does Judaism, and especially esoteric Judaism. Kabbalah there's a lot of Kabbalists that believe also in some kind of reincarnation as well. It's really quite a lot more common, I think, than people give it credit for.
To your earlier point, the way you were describing, on one level, it makes sense. You can't just look at one life. You can't just look at 100 lives. You have to look at totality of life, and remember these lives of people not yet born, right? But it sounded, the way you were describing his explanation or defense of what he was asserting, is it sounds like proto-utilitarianism. If we only knew all the good that was coming to so many people that we don't know, the good of more people, right? We can't just look at one bad thing that happens to a person. But it seemed like you were aggregating. You're saying he was aggregating from the totality of all human lives. And isn't that saying, greatest good for the greatest number?
Yeah, so there's this kind of implicit utilitarian criterion going on where it's kind of a quantitative thing. So yeah, kind of seems like that to me. I can't remember exactly what is the strict criteria that he uses, or I guess what would Leibniz say, be like, no, I'm not giving a utilitarian kind of quantitative aspect or argument for this. I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, it seems at least maybe like you could say that there's something implicit there of a sort of proto-utilitarianism.
Just so I don't appear like a total idiot, I found that section I was thinking of. It's on page 195, section 119. And he quotes something, I assume, from Mr. Bale about happiness, but then he says, it is not strictly true, although it appears plausible, that the benefits God imparts to creatures capable of felicity tend solely to their happiness. Everything is connected in nature. If a skilled artist, an engineer, an architect, or wise politician often makes one of the same things serve several ends, blah, 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 blah. This is making economical use of the ground, the time, the place, the material, which together constitutes expenditure. Thus, God has more than one intention in his projects. The felicity of all rational creatures is one of his aims, but it is not his whole aim, nor even his final aim. This is why the misery of some of these creatures may come about by concomitance and as a result of other greater goods. So anyway, that's kind of what I was thinking of. It's like, his God's plan is to maximize the total good, which doesn't necessarily mean he's going to make anybody in particular happy.
But I guess right there, and that's what I was kind of putting in the chat. I guess because I thought that was kind of maybe what I had said earlier, and I felt like Chase's response was saying that like, no, like this claim of best of all possible, like its radicality even extends to the individual world of like each monad. And
But
that's
it would require an indefinite amount of time to achieve that.
yeah, maybe that's the thing.
Or, yeah, it seems to be a consequence also of the monad reflecting the whole of the universe. If the whole of the universe is the best of all, and then the monad reflects that in itself.
So that to me is just like, trust me, you may not apperceive it, but you are perceptually joyful and like
Yeah, it's right. You have to trust me on this. I am eruditer than you.
that's great.
Your life sucks, but you're really happy. Trust me.
Deeper.
That's good.
Keep calling past the misery. I promise. There's a soft center in the Tootsie Roll Pop.
I can't promise anything for your clear zone, your zone of clarity.
Trust me, I'm your psychiatrist. Things will get better.
Oh, that's good.
Getting better all the time.
Get better all the time.
I mean, like I find it so funny because being kind of like going through just various little spiritual practices and communities and teachings, and like I have like kind of sat with that belief and like found a lot of solace in it in certain phases of my life. And it's like, I'm recalling like, some like pop spiritual, quasi-spiritual self-help book of just like never forget your deepest realization that like you are at peace. And it's just like no matter what, like don't forget that. Whatever your situation, like just remember you are at peace, like even if you don't feel it. And just this kind of like turning that into like a mantric practice of just like no matter your situation, like just stay in touch with that, even if it doesn't seem that way. And I guess like the fact that I think for myself even, and I think a lot of people do find consolation in that.
Well, but you could put it in a different spiritual context, right? Don't worry, you really are at peace, no matter what's happening to you. Don't worry, God really loves you. No matter what you're going through, God really loves you, right? There's multiple spiritual traditions that in effect are saying similar things.
That kind of affirms what I feel like I was saying, like about an hour and a bit ago. Like this seems totally legitimate if it's something you are telling yourself in private. You know what I mean? Like to get through trauma or what have you. It seems like a very cohesive worldview. And one that, like I said, I was appealing to Goethe wearing different hats and having a different cosmology according to what he's doing. And if you're in a personal situation where you're trying to get through some shit, like seems to me like a totally rational program that you could put in front of yourself to help, keep putting one foot in front of the other. It becomes obscene when it becomes public. And the kind of what we're alluding to also, if somebody else were to tell you, you know what I mean? That's when it's obscene. Oh yeah, you're going through some misery, but let me tell you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's I want to say it's wonderful if you can find the strength to tell this to yourself.
Yes. Yeah.
It's disgusting to decide to foist this onto somebody else.
Like the idea of like how like just approaching someone like this like a priori argument. I'm gonna prove to you that even though, or it's like, yeah, I stumble upon this in my meditation. It's like, enlightenment. But yeah, I couldn't imagine, and again, working with the patient population I work with, just immense trauma and addiction. Right, like I'm not gonna walk around and say anything of this nature, like
no, and by the same token, right, if they were starting to espouse these views for themselves going through their trauma, would you want to sit there and go, oh, that sounds like some Leibnizian rationalist,
Bullshit.
You need to get enlightened here, buddy. Have a little, a shakeup of your sense of reason, yada yada, and just kind of like, are you going to intervene there? Like it seems to me like a wonderful way to view the world if that's what you are giving yourself for a purpose.
Yeah, like if a patient comes in my office and starts telling me, I realized this about I'm gonna celebrate it and affirm it and just like, yes, yeah. But when I try to convince a patient of that who's sitting in a dark place.
That kind of reminds me of some of what I've heard Felix Guattari talk about with his patients. What he would do is that you kind of have to make a sort of a experimental judgment call as to whether some of these notions that they come up with are helpful or not, and that you don't want to stifle something just because you say don't rationally agree with it or something like that. Like if it seems to be helping or opening up some new line of development for their, to better their lives, you obviously don't want to block that. So I can see where that would come into play. But yeah, I think Eric, what you were saying about the kind of like the distinction also between like the private and public thing, that's interesting. That's another sort of distinction in Leibniz so this is something where this is more what Deleuze's book talks about, is that that's one of the levels, the public. So the public refers to the kind of crowds of monads that would form the composites, and then they would correspond with, the dominant monad. That would be private. So there is this kind of private public thing going on. Although not exactly in the same way, but also it's interesting is the very last page of Deleuze's book on Leibniz, The Fold, sort of he goes into sort of, okay, well, we're still Leibnizian in that folds are everywhere, but things have changed, the conditions have changed, and so our Leibnizianism needs to be a neo-Leibnizianism. And one of the things he talks about is that the distinction between public and private has become very fuzzy. And so I was thinking that's interesting that you kind of got this distinction going on in Leibniz, it seems like, but that's also the thing where our, I don't know, what do you want to call it, postmodern world, whatever, has it seems to put that in question to at least some degree.
I think it's a modern move to separate out the public and the private. And I would argue that if that distinction's become fuzzy, it's I want to say Gillian Rose, it's the ancient world kind of coming back. It's our modernity fading backwards, right? You know, it's because if you look at, you know, the ancient Greek world, the private and the public are not so clearly distinct, right? So it's modernity unraveling rather than overcoming itself and going to a beyond. But that's, I mean, my polemical idea of postmodernity is no progress at all.
Interesting. So hopefully this doesn't get off topic or not that much off topic, but I was listening to, I think I've referenced this and linked this a few times, but the Nietzsche podcast. So the person who does that, his name Keegan, I think, something. On YouTube, it's Essential Assaults is his name, but it's the Nietzsche podcast. Anyways, he had some kind of YouTube live thing about post-modernity, and he was making similar points to that, but kind of saying that people don't really think enough about really what modernity contributed to that in terms of where people all the time want to talk about. So he's referring to people like Jordan Peterson, whatnot, who will refer to post-modernity, but seem to almost have no conception of how that connects with modernity. And he's making a similar point about that. That yeah, we need to think of, in some cases it's very much established more in modernity exactly what's going on now. I probably didn't explain that very well. Oh well, whatever.
Or you can follow Jameson. And I kind of follow Jameson in large respects here. I see postmodernity as cultural logic of late capitalism. It's modernity having nearly completed itself or misunderstood to have completed itself.
My fear, if we're really, I loved your phrase, Eric, our modernity is running backward. My fear is that it's going to run backward and give us half of what was worse of feudalism, and the other half is going to be what was worse with the ancient world. But instead of getting the good out of both of them, it's somehow going to be what was worse about both of them and mash that together.
Like again, feudal brutality with modern means. That's the nightmare of fascism.
We got harsh sense of hierarchy, right? Supposedly unchanging. And in the ancient world, slavery was much more important than it was in the Middle Ages. I mean, you could say it is the defining, economic characteristic that just bled through. I mean, I read a statistic somewhere that when you look at ancient Athens, maybe 10% of the population was actually participating in the political life of the polis.
So yeah, that reminds me once again, I tell you, I start my ethics and society class with a little bit of Plato's Republic, and I go through the allegory of the cave, and I talk about how this is Plato being a little pissed off about what happened to Socrates, trying to bring truth. And then I mention Plato is very scathing about democracy, and you guys understand. I don't need to make it too explicit, but right, when you give power to the masses, but the masses are uneducated, it descends into demagoguery. And then I say there's no chance that Plato could have played in Plato's world that we could have affected a universal liberating education that would have created the grounds for a healthy and lasting democracy. There was always the possibility that somebody in widespread ignorance, that somebody could come in and play to people's fears and subvert the very democracy which gave, if you look at the 1930s or late 20s, this is again the same motion in action. But where unfortunately in Plato's time there was no chance of abolishing slavery and having full education. But today we live in a world where it's ostensibly possible to educate the electorate to become independent critical thinkers in a way that was never possible in Plato's day, because that's a society predicated on slavery. We have an idea about modern democracy as predicated on the sovereign individual. There's a mythology there, but there's something we can aspire towards, at least in terms of an independent critical thinker as a citizen, which is still, like I said, I'm indicating aspiring towards, because our education system is not getting there yet.
No, I think Plato and Aristotle would look at contemporary America and go, told you so.
Right. And that, yeah, so the hot take I'm dropping is like, I agree with them, except that I'm here doing this work of education because I believe we can do better,
Yeah.
We have to do better.
I wonder what Plato would think of the internet. Especially porn.
Another simulacra?
Or more images on the cave wall that are interfering with people's understanding of what really is.
Yeah.
You'd probably think that the internet should be used by certain people only, maybe.
Maybe the philosopher kings.
Only philosopher kings can look at porn.
I'm sure you guys can appreciate sometimes when you're lecturing, you let slip accidentally on purpose. You let slip certain things, right? So I'm pointing to the allegory of the cave and the shadows on the cave wall. I'm talking about, this two-dimensional space of where representation things happen, like all these prisoners in the cave staring at their screens. I'm sorry, not screens. It's the cave wall. I slipped there. I said screens, but I meant cave wall. You know what I mean? And just, look at all the people just walking around staring at their screens, looking at shadows. And then every once in a while I drop the Magritte painting, Ce n'est pas un pipe. It's in the area.
Yeah.
All simulacra.
I actually brought up in the first day of class I was trying not to sound like the old guy, an anti-tech person. And I was saying, obviously, the information that we have available to us has massively increased. Right, legitimate sources of information, very legitimate information because of computers, things like that. But I said, there's been multiple studies that have been done where actually watching people do what they do, the amount of time they're on the computer, the amount of time they're on social media texting, and that literally the more time spent on that, there's actually a reduction in the attention span. And that when they've done these very simple exams, people are just remembering less, they're less able to make connections. And I just said, think of your writing. I said, do you think you could have composed Lincoln's Gettysburg Address or any play of Shakespeare in a series of text messages? Well, obviously not. You know what I'm trying to say? I mean, I knew the answer, but the point is how much time are you spending on text messages compared to other types of writing? And you are following a framework, a very strict straitjacket in terms of your text message communications, right? LOL, exclamation point, the period has disappeared, telegraphic pieces of information, but really no flow of an argument. And some of the people were like, I could see the wheels turning. I was like, oh yeah, I do spend a lot of, and then I said, look, I understand. That is a very easy, effective way. You're carrying around a telegraph office. You can communicate really easily in text, but the nature of that text is undermining your ability mentally, rationally, to just reason and work through different issues.
Yeah, I think especially Twitter, like there's no way you can have an intelligent conversation on Twitter. It's impossible. Uh and yeah, then you have a character limit and people have to think in terms of it makes people think in terms of sound bites and little chunks of things. It's um a completely different way of reasoning based off the medium that you're using to reason. Or I don't think you can call it reasoning, thinking, I guess, broadly construed. Um, but yeah, that also it goes in a whole bunch of different directions that these mediums of communication are very much not simple, empty, yeah, empty forms that just present in perfect, congruity with the message and just send them over and communicate as a representation. Instead, they are very much shaping the communication and the messages much more than well, basically it's McLuhan medium is the message. I think McLuhan was very, very, very right about the influence of the medium of technology, the media. That's really what is most important. And I think people actually have a better sense of this now. There's something I was listening to where they're talking about McLuhan, and so apparently in the 60s, people had absolutely no idea what the hell he's talking about. Like, what? Electronic village? Medium? What do you mean a book is just like information? I don't understand. And then now with the internet, it's like everybody understands McLuhan. Like, of course, oh, he's talking about the internet, social media. Okay. Yeah. Uh,
I finished my semester with a look at media and talk about the global village and how, again, when Marshall McLuhan's writing about the global village, people were like, this is prophetic. But now that we have the World Wide Web, it seems plausible, like we could actually attain a global village. But then it's an open question, is it actually a village?
Well, and how large can any human community get and still sustain itself? All it seems to do is bring up people who you think you can't stand. I mean, what if people 100 years ago in a Danish newspaper had a political cartoon that could be perceived to be derogatory to the Prophet Muhammad? It's 1923. How many people in the Islamic world would ever know about that political cartoon? Now, someone puts a political cartoon in a newspaper. Someone is able to attach that to an email to their 500 closest friends, who then replicate that. And then there's calls for boycotts of Danish goods and a demand, an apology, and you can't do that. And it's like, excuse me, you helped to distribute, to broadcast what you consider to be demeaning to the Prophet Muhammad. Aren't you culpable in the dissemination of that ridicule? If I thought something was deeply offensive to Christians, I wouldn't go out of my way to keep on sending it to them, because that's what's the point? No, but you know what I'm trying to say. If in certain religious beliefs, if people treat religious figures in a certain way, that in and of itself is a religious offense. Then why isn't it a religious offense to broadcast those images that are considered to be detrimental to a person's faith?
Well, are we ready to retire? No seminar no philosophy seminar next week. The Goethe group is still meeting Wednesday, but nothing on. I did that because I figured we're switching to Monday nights, and to have Leibniz tonight and then being in time 3 days later would be kind of hard. So, um, we're meet the first Heidegger will be a week from Monday, and we may have 2 or 3 people from UTSA. I don't know. Deirdre is threatening to join, and then she has a friend. I don't know if you know him. Chase, what's this guy's name?
Yeah, so right before,
Richard Wells.
yeah, so he's a another graduate student of just needs a thesis. I think there's something like 6 of us now. It's yeah.
Are you all Alistair students?
Yeah.
Hanging out
There's
with
nobody, I honestly nobody else can even nobody else can do anything that isn't there's like one guy that does super analytical like philosophy of religion and just anything analytical. And then pretty much there's nobody else. There's
you to get some
yeah,
different.
the other a lot of the professors I mean have actually just kind of left, and there's yeah, if you want to do anything with associated with continental, Alistair is absolutely the only person that is capable of anything.
Really?
Yeah, that's why he has something like 6 thesis students.
Well, I mean, UT's is in the same situation.
I was about to say, right? They've got Higgins,
Yep,
and that's it.
yep.
That's nuts.
Yep.
There are universities in the U.S. that have strong continental programs, but they're definitely not the majority.
Not you. Yeah, I feel like some Randian objectivists influence that UT department to make them
There is one it's on faculty there.
right, right. Yeah, it just feels to me like, Austin, capital of Texas, we had they had to target that, like we got the fossil fuel industry here. We got to make sure we make at least this philosophy department safe for free enterprise. And we're going to push out all the continentals.
Yeah, I mean, apparently when I got there, I was told that years ago UT was roughly a third ancient, a third continental, and a third analytic. And over the years, they just, as the continental people left, they just replaced them with analytic people. And so they still have a strong ancient program, but the continental program is almost gone.
Why wouldn't you bring continentals in? What's the agenda? What's going on?
I just assumed it was the people in authority were analytics.
Also, the chair of the department can have such an influence on search committees and even the dispensation of a new. I mean, he or she could have not made a very strong case to keep the continental seat when a professor retired, and then 2 years later comes up with a proposal to the dean and above. Hey, this is a sphere of analytic we don't have, analytical plus we don't have. Like, oh, okay. Do you have any? I mean, it's a lot of times. Sadly, if someone's adept bureaucratically, it's a 2-step process. Just don't push very hard. Tell your faculty, geez, I tried, and they don't talk to the people who talk to deans. And then you just wait a year or two and then you push, and the other professors are happy because, well, at least we got another line back, but it's at the cost of shrinkage of the continentals. My department, well, I don't want to say we're still on tape, I think. So, but something similar is going on in the political science department because of the chair.